bringing people together of all walks of life to talk about ancient alien theory, aliens in general, experiences, UFOs. It's a place where we can all come together, talk about it, not be judged, and have a good time. So that's kind of what we're going to be doing today. This is a series of my show I call Witness Accounts. And this is where people come onto my show and tell their UFO stories in their own voices. I think that is much more important than me relaying their story to the audience, is hearing them tell their own story, how they experienced it, what they think it was, and the impact it had on their lives. UFOs come and go in the blink of an eye, but the impact they have on people can be extremely strong in many aspects of their lives. So what we're going to sort of start out with here today is telling you guys about our own personal UFO encounters, because we both have had them, and that's kind of set us on the path we are today. So I guess I'll share mine first, if you don't mind.
Yeah, sure, go for it.
Yeah. So I was 12 years old, and this was in the central New York area on the East Coast, and I was fishing off of a dock at a motel with my parents, and we were on a weekend getaway, and this river, the St. Lawrence River, literally was the border between the U.S. and Canada, and it was just turning dark, and I was out on the dock at the motel fishing by myself, listening to Green Day on my Discman. This is back in 1995. Yep, it was the Dookie album. I remember that specifically, and it was starting to get dark, so I reeled my line in because I was done for the night, and I noticed a reflection in the water, and it was 3 white lights. And at first I thought it was something in the water, so I got down and looked, and then I realized, clearly this was a reflection. So naturally I look up, and I can't tell you how high it was, but there was a triangular formation with 3 white lights and a sort of reddish orange basketball thing in the middle, and it was just hovering above me, this formation. I didn't see a structure to this thing. I didn't see any mechanics, nothing like that. I only saw this formation of lights, but I could not see anything behind the formation. I couldn't see the stars, I couldn't see the moon, nothing like that, and it just hovered silently. It was very, very big, and I remember trying to scream for my father, who was in the motel, probably, I don't know, maybe 40 feet away from me, and I couldn't get anything out. I was so scared at what I was looking at, and I felt frozen there. I couldn't move, and I just kind of stared up, kept watching this thing, and then it started to float over the water, and that's when I finally, for some reason, was able to get out of this frozen state, and I squealed to my father. I was like, Dad, you gotta see this. And he runs out, and he did catch the tail end of this triangular formation as it either headed towards Canada and disappeared out of sight, or literally submerged into the water. Neither of us know. We've argued about that, about what we both think happened, but that was kind of it for me. I was terrified at what I'd seen. I knew that planes made noise, and this made no noise. It hovered and then started to move silently, and I had nightmares for years after that. I didn't really talk about it with anyone, and my dad didn't talk about it either, and I kind of became obsessed after that. I wanted to sort of educate myself to get rid of that fear and terror that I felt that night. I started taking out books at the library on UFOs and Bigfoot, anything I could get my hands on, and that kind of sent me on the path I am today, interviewing witnesses who had experiences like me, were afraid to talk about it for a really long time, but now are ready to embrace it.
So it's interesting, every time I hear your story, that the fear you describe,
yeah,
right? Because it seems irrational when you think about it, because this thing didn't do any sort of hostile act towards you. It didn't do anything that made you think it was going to hurt you, but it was this unknown, and that unknown created this fear, and that's common among people who witness these bizarre things they can't explain, that are outside of their reality.
Oh, absolutely. And I mean, again, I was only a kid, but I knew, and I was no aviation expert, but I knew that whatever the thing was, it should have been making some sort of noise if this was like a vehicle of some sort, or a blimp, or even a balloon. Like this thing hovered, stopped, and then went over the water. So it was a fear of the unknown, I think, that really stuck with me. Yeah. But yeah, I know, Jason, you've had a few experiences, so I would love if you wouldn't mind sharing some of those with the audience as well.
Sure. The most exciting one, I think, probably has to be the Phoenix Lights, and many of you are probably familiar with the Phoenix Lights, but just a quick overview. The Phoenix Lights occurred over the state of Arizona and some neighboring states too, in March of 1997. This was a mass UFO sighting seen by thousands of people across the state. As with any UFO sighting, and specifically a mass UFO sighting, you have varying stories from all these witnesses. That's how witness testimony works. But essentially, a large craft was seen traversing the entire state by lots of people. There was also a series of about 7 lights seen just stationary in the sky. And there were also reportedly military flares dropped that night at a different time that doesn't coincide with the mass sighting that occurred. What I witnessed that night was a series of 7 stationary lights in the sky. And although that doesn't sound all that exciting, especially for somebody like me now looking back on it, somebody who spent more than a decade researching and writing about UFOs and really looking into strange things in the sky and not so strange things in the sky to learn what is up there, what isn't up there, and what things should look like in the sky if I were to see those things. That night was really bizarre for me. So I grew up in rural Arizona on the far west side of the Phoenix metro area. Nothing around. Very remote area, just out in the desert. And I spent a lot of time outside, and specifically camping too, because there was nothing else for me to do. It was a very, very sad childhood. So I spent a lot of time outside, and I was just walking around our property that night and happened to notice this series of 7 lights just hovering what seemed to be directly overhead. They weren't moving. They weren't making any sound. They weren't altering at all in their luminosity or anything. They were just these solid lights that were there in the sky above my head. So I watched them for a while, and I was pretty fascinated, but I was also a teenager with a short attention span. So after watching these things for a while, I got bored and I went back inside. Well, I came out sometime later. Those lights were still there. And at some point, my brain started working properly, and I got the video camera and started recording these things. These lights were what seemed to be over our property. I mean, they were pretty high up, not that high up, but pretty high up. But they were in the sky there. For what I estimate, and again, this is 1997, I don't remember precisely, but I like to say about 45 minutes, these lights were in the sky. I was very familiar with military flares because I grew up where I had line of sight to the Barry Goldwater test range, which is where they frequently would drop military flares. I saw these things all the time and knew what military flares looked like and saw them quite frequently. What I saw was not military flares. What I saw, I have no idea what could possibly explain what I saw. Even to this day, looking back, with hindsight, knowing what I know now with all of my investigation and looking into UFOs specifically, I still cannot come up with any logical explanation for what I saw that night.
Yeah, the Phoenix Lights is probably one of the most famous mass UFO sightings in history. And what a lot of people don't really take into consideration is so many people saw this, and so many people reported it, and so many people were affected by it. And the official title for this episode is The Power of Witness Testimony. And I wanted to ask Jason, along with some of you later on, what importance witness testimony plays within the UFO research that we do. You can have dates and times of a UFO event, you can have all the data you want, but if you don't have a witness telling the story of what they saw or experienced, we have absolutely nothing to work off of. So how important is that, Jason?
Sometimes it's really, like you said, it's all we have, and you and I talk about this a lot. But right now, people want photos and videos of UFOs, and that's fantastic. I would love photos and videos of UFOs, and we see lots of them all the time. However, we know that we live in a time where photos and videos can be faked very easily. You can pull out an app on your phone and create a very realistic UFO sighting right out the window. So on one hand, as a researcher, you want the best photo and video evidence. On the other hand, that only counts for so much. It's contributing evidence, but you also know it can be very, very, very faked. However, with the Phoenix Lights specifically, I'll point out, yes, you had thousands of witnesses. And you think about that, you're all, oh, that's cool. Thousands of people saw these lights in the sky or saw a craft moving across the state. That's cool. But then you take it further and you talk about the governor of the state at that time. You bring the government into it. And at the time, yes, when people think about this, they think about how he publicly sort of ridiculed it on TV. He held a press conference. He brought out his staffer in an alien costume and said, "We found the culprit responsible," and sort of made a joke out of it and said, "This just shows people are taking it way too seriously. Like, chill out." Later, he went on the record and said he did that because people were freaking out. He wanted to calm the public. But the biggest thing, and again, this comes to witness testimony and the power of witness testimony when you bring the government into it. This was the governor of the state of Arizona. And he went on CNN and later some documentaries too, to state that he too saw the Phoenix Lights that night. He was bewildered by them. He had been an Air Force pilot and knew what things looked like in the sky. He actively tried to get answers from the military about what happened that night. They wouldn't give him any information. It wasn't until, I think, more than a year later when they came out and said, "Oh yeah, by the way, that was us, we dropped flares," but their explanation they gave didn't even align with the time when the incident happened. But this was the governor of the state trying to get answers from the Air Force Base in Arizona. He couldn't get answers at all. And he also says that not only was he a witness that night, but what he saw was not of this earth. That's the governor of the state of Arizona going on record making that claim. So, yes, it's powerful when you have thousands of people. When you talk about it or read about it, that's just a number on a paper. When you're reading a story, you're all, oh yeah, thousands of people, that's cool. But then when you bring in somebody in a governmental public service position like the governor of a state also saying, yeah, I saw it too, and it wasn't from this planet.
Yeah.
That's powerful.
It's very powerful. And I think what's also really interesting is we both work with a colleague named Cheryl Costa who wrote a desk reference book that's literally like this thick. And it goes from, maybe like 2 decades of UFO reports throughout the United States. It goes by, I think, count from like state all the way down to county of reported UFO events in a certain area. And it's amazing to see these graphs and charts of all this data that she's brought forward, but it also helps us as UFO researchers to find these areas, these hotbeds, as we call them, of where all these reports are coming from. So if you have an area in, somewhere in California where there's been 700 reports versus somewhere else in the country that had 2 reports, we're going to go to that area because clearly there's activity going on there that a lot of people are seeing, and we're going to interview the people who saw these things and get their stories. So I think while data and all that is very important, it's mixing that with the story and trying to find patterns that really brings ufology to life. You have the people who work with witnesses, and then you have the people who record the data.
And I love UFO data so much. Yeah. So Cheryl's work is awesome. It's nice to have that data to point to. But coming back to witness testimony, I love seeing that being a huge emphasis in the History Channel's new show, Unidentified. They really focus on witness testimony, and specifically the witness testimony of Navy fighter pilots and Navy service members aboard ships who are operating radar systems, and hearing from service members about UFO encounters. That's also very powerful.
Absolutely. I mean, I'm going to be talking to one of the Navy radar operators that was a part of the Nimitz encounter later this week. And already after a phone interview with him, he told me flat out, like, this changed my life. It really did. I was there to do my job. I fell into a UFO event, and it's changed every aspect of my life since then. So
again, about the power of witness testimony, you talk a lot to witnesses, people who claim to have seen lights in the sky, all the way to having, encounter experiences, abduction experiences, things like that. And in your case, I know you've read like emails they've written or read about their stories ahead of time, but how different is it for you when you actually meet the person face to face and hear that story from their mouth?
It's a hell of a lot different. I mean, I get emails on a daily basis of people saying they saw something or they experienced something, and the email is literally like 20 pages long, and I would love to answer every email back and be like, yeah, I'm going to look into your case, but it's daunting. It can be very daunting when you get these sort of correspondence, because I don't know what the hell they saw. I can try to help them along the way, but for me, it did come down to when I decided as a quote-unquote UFO journalist that I was going to go out and meet these people having these experiences. And I remember the first person I met face to face, I was in Arizona, and I was in a diner, and I was with her and her husband, and she was recalling to me for the very first time she told anyone about this other than her husband, an experience she had as a child with what she believes to have been some sort of non